Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Ipshita Chanda and I teach comparative literature at Jadavpur University. This module is an overview of the entire course, that is, African and Caribbean writing in English. The aim of this section is to create a framework for the different modes of literary expression by placing them in the culture created by colonialism, which we have considered in Model 1 and 2. This section sketches the literary milieu of Anglophone African and Caribbean literatures. As in the other modules of this set, the material provided is meant to form a continuous reference point for the reading of the literary texts. This section specially focuses on the understanding of the sources of genre and theme, both in local and colonizers' cultures, thus also providing a located and a comparative method of reading African and Caribbean literatures. The first question that faces us is, given the diversity of Africa and the variety of its history, what can we call African literature? For this, the best thing would be to quote some lines from Chinua Achebe. What is African literature? Chinua Achebe was asked, and he replied, "You cannot cram African literature into a small, neat definition. I do not see African literature as one unit, but as a group of associated units. In fact, the sum total of all the national and ethnic literatures of Africa." By the ethnic literatures, he means mainly the oral cultures. The crossover from a purely oral culture to a script culture has been considered in detail later on in this module. The national element is a response to the colonial culture, the negotiations with European colonizers, and the crafting of one's own position, first as a subject people, then as aspirants for freedom, and finally as sovereign nations. So, African literature is composed of many languages, and it is not only written but also oral and performed. Now, this is no surprise since Africa is a continent. Our tendency to homogenize it or reduce it to only the part that we know is one of the problems that besets the study of African literatures in the plural. When we refer to African literature written in English or Anglophone African literatures, this clarifies what we are looking for and suggests ways of getting there. What follows is intended to be an overview of this kind. We consider specific points in relation between English and the African continent to show how verbal arts are produced in a situation of colonial contact, whether they be written or oral. The first thing, as usual, that we have to consider when we are looking at literature is language. And the language that we have to consider, of course, is English. Let us remember Achebe's defense of writing in the colonizer's language, albeit that the local languages did not have scripts and hence could not produce verbal art that was written. Achebe says, African writers who have chosen to write in English or French are not unpatriotic smart alecks with an eye on the main chance outside their own countries. They are byproducts of the same process that made the new nation states of Africa. Thus, Achebe defines his English, which is arguably foundational to Anglophone Africa, if not the Anglophone world. Achebe's view of the relevance of English of the colonies, including his own, is clear. It is difficult to think of anything clearer than his naming of the players in the game. I quote from Achebe, "The price a world language must be prepared to pay is submission to many different kinds of use. The African writer should aim to use English in a way that brings out his message best, without altering the language to the extent that its value as a medium of international exchange will be lost. He should aim at fashioning an English which is at once universal and able to carry his peculiar experience. Achebe seems to be stating with cold rationality the pronouncement of Louise Bennett, who said that she found Jamaican people colonizing England in reverse. What does this mean for language, the medium of literature? We have discussed the role played by English as a means of social and economic mobility. In this section, we will consider the forging of a literary language and influences that contributed to this process. The distinct nature of African English can be clear by comparing it to Indian English, for example. If we take, for example, two writers who are considered pioneers in their own fields, R.K. Narayan and Amos Tutuola, we will see the difference between them quite clearly. Tutuola was a first-generation Nigerian writer, and R.K. Narayan was preceded by a number of other Indians who had already written in English. So R.K. Narayan came into a tradition of established English writing in India, whereas Tutuola was a pioneer in that tradition. Having no indigenous English tradition to fall back upon in the middle of the 20th century, Tutuola looked towards the orators for form and theme and for ideas of genre. Even though he was writing in the Roman script and in the English language, the syntax, the themes, the ways of storytelling that he used all came from his own language, that is Uruba. So Tutuola's work functions thematically within a local tradition of literature and a particular tradition of orature, whose language is the language of the chapbooks that flooded the Onitsha market in Igbo land in eastern Nigeria, a language that could be identified as English but was creatively accommodated to suit the needs of the nesting culture from which the themes were drawn. Not even Nigerians living in England, and no doubt obsessed with Queen's English, were willing to grant that Tutuola had actually written in English or done anything of any remote significance to the realm of English or Nigerian literature. But Tutuola had begun a tradition of moving from the oral to the written, which framed the future of African literatures written in English. Chimamanda Adichie's book, Americana, recounts experiences of a Nigerian and a Jamaican who had similar reading habits in childhood. Both the former native of Nigeria and the former native of Jamaica in the Caribbean had a common favorite when they were young, Enid Blyton. The difference in the English spoken in Britain, the US, Anglophone Africa, and Black America are also part of this author's observations. The intrusion of the member of the Commonwealth of British Nations into the mother country is described by Wole Soyinka's poem Telephone Conversation, where a prospective British landlady tries to gauge the degree of blackness of her future tenant and the African tenant tries to keep the African accent from his English. The Commonwealth was an economic ploy to keep the raw material of the former colonies in partial control through a preferential relationship with the newly independent states. English, and correct English in particular, were standards of honor. As Adichie's heroine in Americana, Ifemelu, observes about her father's use of words, the language that he speaks makes her feel ashamed to own him as her father. Clearly, his language is more Nigerian than hers, which is more American English. The Nigerian author Tope Folarin, in the short story Miracle, which won the Kane Prize for African Writing in 2013, regarded the accent of his Nigerian educated father, which no one could understand in America. The effects of English on the empire have received much attention. Anglophone African and Caribbean literatures thus fulfills the demands Achebe placed on English as a world language, charting the effects that the empire had upon the language itself. The position of English in the colonies has come under great debate, as we have already studied in the language debate in Module 2. The two opposite positions being espoused by Achebe and Ngugi. The reason for this is that the colonial policy espoused by the colonizer, namely the English, in Kenya and in Nigeria were different because Kenya was a settler colony and Nigeria was not. The issue of land, therefore, proved strongly persuasive in Kenya and was linked directly to economic deprivation, whereas in Nigeria, the struggle was more for citizenship rights, freedom and democracy as abstract, modern, Western concepts that defined nationalism. The reference to the Babus in India and their counterparts in Nigeria is enough to indicate the nature of the anti-colonial struggle in both India and Nigeria. There were no Babus or their equivalents in Kenya, though the struggle was spearheaded by English-educated leaders like Dedan Kimathi, J.M. Karuiki, and Jomo Kenyatta. The militant Mau Mau nationalists were peasants fighting for their livelihood, not for what Ngugi, in the trial of Dedan Kimathi, calls flag independence. Little wonder then that Ngugi's position on English as a language of African literature is different from Achebe's. It is out of the history of colonization and the anti-colonial struggle peculiar to Kenya that Ngugi proposed the abolition of English departments. Thus, the influence of English as a system of education as well as a tool to access the world of an alien culture differed according to local conditions. In certain areas, like in Igbo land, in what is now eastern Nigeria, the Christian culture and book culture entered hand in hand. Norms of civilized living, as well as mores in translation, find expression in the vast body of slim printed volumes with rough and ready production values, which make up the Onitsha market literature, where they were sold like other produce. This is an instance of a flourishing literate culture in English that formed the basis of a representative African writer like Chinua Achebe. Some, like the Nigerian writer Cyprian Ekwensi, wrote both for the Onitsha reader and for the more sober international reader of the Heinemann African Writers series. Another strong influence on the milieu of book production in a scriptless society was the impulse to record oral tales as well as performances. In societies like the Uruba, where no scripts existed, the Roman script was used for writing English narratives as well as Uruba narratives, using the resources of oral forms. For example, D.O. Fagunwa wrote in Uruba but used the Roman script. Ala Bingo and Amenuko wrote in Igbo but used the Roman script. They were pioneers of a shift to a written culture from an oral one, to a culture of reading from a culture of hearing and seeing. Besides this, they also used the resources of oral narratives. For example, in Fagunwa's narrative, Forest of a Thousand Demons, the oral situation of storytelling is created by the author. The author is visited by a hunter who wants to tell his story so that it may be written down in order for it to be preserved for the future generations. This provides an excuse and a situation in which the stories that the hunter tells can be recorded by the writer. Thus, the oral situation enters the written text in the form of a frame story. Fagunwa's work has influences stretching from the writers of Wole Soyinka on to Ben Okri, particularly in his Booker Prize-winning novel, The Famished Road, written in 1991, and the sequel, Songs of Enchantment, written in 1993. Amos Tutuola's son says of him that the writer lived steeped within the oral culture, collecting stories from his village on an old Pi reel-to-reel tape recorder. buying palm wine to entertain his guests, who would be competing to tell the best stories they could. But, said Tutuola's son, he used very few of these stories in his books, for he himself could develop a story from just about anything. Tutuola's greatest achievement was that he wrote Uruba's speech into English without allowing the English language to exercise its power as a medium. His English was shaped to fit his experience and that of his audience, which thought and felt in Uruba but could read English. The rhythms of spoken Uruba resound in Tutuola's English, just like the rhythms of Caribbean Creole. This English is made a vehicle for the voice and presence of the colonized. Recent critics describe Tutuola's work as an African magic realism, or it has African animist realism, and trace in it the tradition in which Ben Okri writes. Though Okri and Tutuola do not belong to the same community, the incorporation of aspects of their traditional metaphysical belief system and its syncretic blend of elements from the real, the esoteric, and the supernatural are common to their works. The specific techniques borrowed from the oral tradition and from the orators thus mark the work of all the African writers and the Caribbean writers. One of the techniques of the oral tradition is the use of idiom inversion, the refiguring of images and symbols received through the English language and reflect the colonial culture. These symbols were refigured or inverted to express the realities of the colonial oppression. For example, Ngugi's play on the Mau Mau guerrillas is called The Trial of Dedan Kimathi. We see the redefinition of a number of hero figures in this book and the redefinition of patriotism and nationalism as concepts. Kimathi was a Mau Mau guerrilla leader, labeled a terrorist by the colonial administration. But in the play which bears his name, the writer figures him as a true nationalist, judged according to an indigenous set of values. He fights for the liberation of the land and its equal distribution rather than for a flag and an anthem, the cosmetic attributes of a newly independent nation. In both this play and in his novel Devil on the Cross, written in Gikuyu, Ngugi inverts the religious symbolism of Christianity. The trial of Dedan Kimathi is planned like the trial of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. The temptations and the passion of Christ form the model of the episodes, as Kimathi is tempted by different colonial officials to give up his struggle for land rights and take liberal democracy instead. In Devil on the Cross, the name itself suggests the inversion. Christianity was a weapon of oppression for the colonies, and Christ on the cross could not represent the suffering colonized people because they had been colonized and oppressed in his name. Another oral technique used by the writers in Africa and the Caribbean are proverbs. According to Achebe, proverbs are the palm oil which spice the words that are eaten. Compound words, for example, like the mouth that eats salt and pepper, or given names which describe the bearer of the name and connect him to particular incidents in the individual or community's life, are also common idiomatic usage in the local languages. These idiomatic usages in the local languages are directly translated into English by African and Caribbean writers. The mixture of languages in a single text also marks this writing. We have talked about Creole. Pidgin is the English used or pronounced as the locals use it. Pidgin and the local language exist simultaneously in the text according to the position and background of the character and the speaking voice. For example, in Chinua Achebe's Antilles of the Savannah or in Soyinka's Season of Anomy, Pidgin, Igbo English, Uruba English the narrator's own voice intermingle. In Amata Aidu's Our Sister Killjoy, Memories of a Black-Eyed Squint, the difference in English spoken by the Indian expatriate and the Ghanaian expatriate contributes to the poetic nature of the work. We can now turn to English writing in the Caribbean. The formation of Caribbean English that we have already discussed in Module 2 forms a background for what we will talk about next. The boom in Anglo-Creole literary production of the 1960s led to Sylvia Wynter and Edward Kamau Braffet's strikes against Louis James' failure to speak meaningfully of resistance and community in his edited 1968 collection of Caribbean literature called The Islands in Between. Caribbean English consisted of elements inherited from colonial institutions and, as Braffet named it, the little tradition nurtured from folk traditions, vernacular languages, and the politics of social engagement. These factions collided spectacularly at the 1971 Association for Commonwealth Language and Literature Studies Conference in Jamaica, starting a memorable decade of debate and dispute in terms of the emergent critical agendas in the Caribbean. In this context, Louise Bennett is defined as the first great nation language poet by Braffet. Like Dante in Italy or Langston Hughes in Black America, Louise Bennett, Braffet says, helped to legitimize the use of a national vernacular when dominant norms deemed the local language unworthy of poetry. In this sense, Bennett can also be seen as a national poet of the border Anglophone Caribbean, with the use of a special kind of English defining the nation. Her work puts Jamaican English in a global Anglophone framework, comparing it to other dialects legitimized by what she calls the Oxford Book are English verse. Them start fi tritone language from the 14th century, 500 years gone, and them got more dialect than we. The Caribbeans were colonized by a number of European powers, and the shared Caribbean culture was based not on the colonizer's culture, that is English or French, but the colonized culture, in this case, African. So Francophone Caribbean literature may share traits with French literature rather than with English literature, taught and practiced in Anglophone colonies. But certain common traits may be identified in both, which are related to the African experience and heritage. In literary terms, the reaction of the African Caribbean people to the denigration of their race in Eurocentric art and criticism took different forms across time. Broad movements can be identified, as we will discuss now. The first thing that we might discuss under the rubric of broad movements is the assimilation of European aesthetic paradigms. That is, to use the critic's own cultural codes to prove their own abilities. The mimic aspect of Caribbean culture derives from this. However, what is included within the scope of mimicry and its tone, satirical or slavish, changes the effect of representation. The second part of this movement may be described as the response to the negative racist representation of slave societies by forging or approximating an African aesthetics as perceived by post-slavery society. The quest for an African home and a reaction against this, asserting with Walcott that we are here, that is in the Caribbean islands, highlights the brutal condition of the slaves who, once forcibly taken away from Africa, could not return. This made them distinctly different from those who could return to their homelands, and so the Caribbean diaspora literatures have a peculiar and unique tone to them. Out of these streams, a synthesis characteristic of post-colonial societies is forged by Derek Walcott. Walcott attempts to derive a special Caribbean aesthetics. Proudly accepting the islands as his home, Walcott and the thinkers who follow him concentrate on crafting a common imaginary in the face of the constant movement and diversity of the population. C.L.R. James's History of Caribbean Cricket is one of the early instances of this kind of writing. Rather than project an image of vengeance, recrimination, and despair, this would appear to be distinctly a Caribbean way of thinking old frames like nation and defining new ones like plurality. We have referred to the historylessness of both the Caribbean and the African people in the intellectual estimation of the West. The narratives of establishment of empires that we find in oral epics like Sundiata or Shaka, and the legends of heroes that we find in sagas like Ozidi or Movindo, were not considered worthy of being called epics by the colonizers because they were oral. In the Caribbean, the oral traditions were built up from memories of slaves with very little written, as slaves were deprived of education until after emancipation. The thrust of V.S. Naipaul's criticism referred to the Caribbean as a passageway. People who lived there had been wiped out, those who passed through did not have any commitment to it, and those who were forced to live there, that is the slaves, were kept forcibly in seclusion and slavery. Naipaul devalued the African forms of recording knowledge, and so he pronounced that these slaves, who were now inhabitants of the Caribbean, had no past and therefore were historyless. Naipaul's Caribbean vision is the negative frame against which Walcott and Lamming were writing, and their works can be read as marks of their cultural commitment. They insist on their ability to render a West Indian world that could understand the stakes of its own history, however much it was damaged by the brutalities of the past. The force of Walcott's claim that what has mattered is the loss of history, the amnesia of the races, what has become necessary is imagination, is now fully recognized within Caribbean literary history. The imagination has been considerably broadened by the wealth of traditional cultures available due to the diversity of race. The two histories of the island, living side by side, detailed by the anthropologist Peter J. Wilson and recorded in his book Crab Antics, points to this characteristic of the Caribbean. We will now consider in some detail the effect of orality upon the written literature of Africa and the Caribbean islands. An indigenous voice develops out of Anglophone African and Caribbean societies when the rhythm of local speech may be heard through the English language. Conjoined ballad stanzas creolize a poetic structure from the British Isles with Jamaican diction, orthography, and rhythms, inverting the earlier penetration of Jamaican space by European colonialism. The oral performance traditions are replicated in Caribbean poetry, especially in voice poetry, dub poetry, and in the Jamaican DJ tradition. Bow's Caribbean writer and his quarrel with history brought dread talk to the page. The renaissance of Jamaican local theatre, with playwrights Dennis Scott and Trevor Rohn, and the creative zenith of roots reggae, all structured a self-consciousness about history and the demands of the future. From Claude McKay and Louise Bennett to Grace Nichols and Linton Kwesi Johnson, poets and singers of the African diaspora have creolized metropolitan British English with African and Caribbean spaces and styles, remaking London, in the words of the rap artist Lord Kitchener's buoyant calypso as the place for me, and given rise to a group of transnational poets of African origin like Michael Smith, Jean Binta Breeze, and Benjamin Zephaniah. They may be from different nations and different parts of the colonies, but they all use local history sources and local verbal resources gleaned from their African origins and the common experience of racism and slavery as part of their poetry. Having spoken in detail about the underlying elements of Anglophone writing in African and the Caribbean, we turn in the last section of this module to the kinds of criticism that this literature gave rise to. The first kind of criticism that we can talk about is local criticism. The response among the English-speaking Nigerians to Amos Tutuola's replication of Uruba speech rhythms in the palm wine drink-card was puritanical, comparable to the first generation of Caribbean mimic men. The anglicized Nigerians took it upon themselves to defend the English language against the incursions of lesser educated people like Tutuola. They defended English with greater zeal than the English themselves, and they refused to see anything good in the efforts of what they called a semi-literate writer by Western standards, who was nevertheless an undeniably professional raconteur by Uruba standards. To them, anything and everything had to conform to Western tests and standards in order to be acceptable. Tutuola's work, ironically, was not known in Nigeria until the palm wine drink-card was published in England by Faber and Faber in 1952. The next school of criticism we will consider is what Chinua Achebe called the colonialist school. According to him, the standards imposed on Anglophone African writing by established British critics could not judge African writing in English because African writing in English, despite being in English, had its own standards. According to Achebe, the colonialist critic, unwilling to accept the validity of sensibilities other than his own, has made a particular point of dismissing the African novel. He has written lengthy articles to prove its non-existence, largely on the grounds that the novel is a peculiarly Western genre, a fact which would interest us if it was our ambition to write Western novels. In any case, did not the black people in America, deprived of their own musical instruments, take the trumpet and the trombone and blow them as they had never been blown before, as indeed they were not designed to be blown? And was not the result jazz? Is anyone going to say that this was a loss to the world, or that those first Negro slaves who began to play around with the discarded instruments of their masters should have played waltzes and foxtrots? No, let every people bring their gifts to the great festival of the world's cultural harvest, and mankind will be all the richer for the variety and distinctiveness of the offerings. Another form of criticism that we may identify is Romanticist criticism. The response to colonialist criticism was to emphasize the indigenous basis of African writing and pronounce the standards based upon them. This was called Africanist literary criticism. In this critical scheme, orality is treated both as a source, the origin and precursor to modern literature, and as a resource, a rich heritage or a fund of themes, motives, images, and techniques upon which the modern author can draw. But scholars of orality, like Karin Barber, have pointed out that Romanticism still surrounds the notion of orality. Even in post-colonial critical discourses, informed by destabilizing irony, orality sometimes remains the last unexamined essentialist concept projected, according to Karin Berber, as an imagined antithesis of writing. She calls this tendency romanticist criticism. Finally, we come to Africanist or nativist criticism. This is the combative position taken by Shinwizu, Madubuike, and Jemi in their book, The Decolonization of African Literature, which is inspired by Obiwali's position that the real African literature is written in African languages. As we have seen in the language debate at Nairobi, this view of African literature is supported by writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Tabanlo Leong. In this module, we have provided a literary background to the work that will be studied in the rest of the course. The best way of understanding and applying the critical tools that we have discussed in this particular module is, of course, to read the literature itself.